Grace Thompson's hands trembled as she dusted the silver frame in Alexander Hartford's study. The boy's face in the photograph made her heart stop. "Boss, that boy grew up with me in the orphanage," she shouted. What Alexander revealed next would shatter everything she thought she knew about the man she'd been serving for 3 years. Grace Thompson had learned 3 essential rules during her 22 years of domestic service. Never ask questions, never make assumptions, and never, under any circumstances, look too closely at the personal belongings of the people who employed you. But on that humid Tuesday morning in June, as she dusted the mahogany shelves in Alexander Hartford's private study, all 3 rules shattered in the span of a single heartbeat. The silver frame caught the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hartford mansion. Grace had dusted that particular frame dozens of times over the past 3 years of working for Alexander Hartford, but she'd never actually looked at the photograph inside. It was positioned on a high shelf, angled away from casual viewing, as if Alexander wanted it there but didn't want to see it every day. Today, however, Grace was using the ladder to reach the upper shelves, a deep cleaning that Mrs. Patricia Hartford, Alexander's mother, had specifically requested before the family's annual charity gala that weekend. And from this elevated position, Grace found herself staring directly at a face that made her cleaning cloth slip from her fingers and fall silently to the Persian rug below. The boy in the photograph couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He had sandy blonde hair that stuck up in the back, a gap between his front teeth, and eyes that held a mixture of mischief and sadness that Grace recognized instantly, because she had seen those exact eyes every single day for 6 years of her childhood. The photograph showed the boy standing in front of what appeared to be an orphanage, though not just any orphanage. Grace would recognize those brick walls anywhere, the distinctive arched doorway, the oak tree in the corner that she and the other children had climbed, despite Sister Margaret's constant warnings. St. Catherine's Home for Children in upstate New York. The same orphanage where Grace had lived from age 7 to 13, before being placed with a foster family. The same orphanage where she had met Michael Chen, the boy who had been her best friend, her defender, her family when she had no family. "No," Grace whispered, gripping the ladder so tightly her knuckles turned white. It can't be. But there was no mistaking it. The face in that photograph belonged to Michael. Her Michael. The boy who had shared his dinner with her when she first arrived at St. Catherine's, terrified and alone. The boy who had taught her how to tie her shoes and told her stories to help her fall asleep when nightmares woke her. The boy who had promised they would be friends forever, no matter what. The boy who had vanished from St. Catherine's one autumn day when Grace was 12 years old, adopted by a family whose name she never learned, leaving Grace behind with a hole in her heart that had never quite healed. Grace's breath came in short gasps, as memories flooded back with overwhelming force. Michael stealing extra cookies from the kitchen and splitting them with her behind the gymnasium. Michael standing up to the older kids who teased her for being the quiet one. Michael crying the night before his adoption, telling Grace he didn't want to leave her, that she was his real sister, even if they didn't share blood. "I'll find you someday," he had promised, his 8-year-old voice breaking with emotion. "When I'm grown up, I'll find you and we'll be family again. I promise, Gracie." But he never did find her. And after years of waiting, hoping, searching through social media and adoption registries, Grace had finally accepted that Michael was gone from her life forever. She had built walls around that pain, learned to function without constantly wondering what had happened to the only person who had truly understood what it meant to grow up unwanted, unloved, invisible. And now here was his face, staring at her from a silver frame in the study of Alexander Hartford, one of the wealthiest men in New York. "Why?" Grace breathed, her voice barely audible. "Why does Alexander have Michael's picture?" The sound of footsteps in the hallway sent a jolt of panic through Grace's body. She scrambled down the ladder, retrieved her fallen cloth, and was halfway across the study when Alexander himself appeared in the doorway. At 34 years old, Alexander Hartford was everything Grace was not. Wealthy, educated, confident, and completely at ease in the world that Grace had spent her entire life serving from the shadows. He stood 6 feet tall, with dark hair graying at the temples, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of tailored suit that cost more than Grace earned in 3 months. For 3 years, Grace had worked in the Hartford mansion, maintaining the invisible presence that good domestic workers perfected. Always there when needed, never noticed otherwise. Alexander treated her with distant politeness, the way one might acknowledge a piece of furniture that performed its function adequately. He never raised his voice, never complained, and never, in 3 years, had a conversation with her that lasted longer than 30 seconds. Which is why the expression on his face when he saw her standing frozen in the middle of his study sent ice through Grace's veins. Alexander's eyes moved from Grace's pale face to the silver frame on the shelf, then back to Grace. Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition, or something else Grace couldn't identify. "Grace," he said, his voice careful and controlled. "Is everything all right?" The question hung in the air between them. Grace's mind raced. She had violated the first rule of domestic service. She had looked too closely at something personal. She should apologize, make an excuse, return to her work, and never mention the photograph again. But the words that came out of her mouth were nothing like an apology. "Boss, that boy grew up with me in the orphanage!" The shout escaped before Grace could stop it, years of buried emotion erupting in a single desperate cry. Her hand flew to her mouth in horror at her own outburst, but it was too late. The words hung in the elegant study like shattered crystal, impossible to take back. Alexander's face transformed in an instant. The careful control vanished, replaced by an expression of such raw shock that Grace took an involuntary step backward. "What did you just say?" Alexander's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to. I shouldn't have." Grace stumbled over her words. 22 years of professional training warring with the emotional earthquake happening inside her chest. "I was cleaning the shelf and I saw the photograph and I recognized him. That boy, his name is Michael Chen. We lived together at St. Catherine's Home for Children in upstate New York from 1992 to 1998. He was my best friend. He was adopted and I never saw him again." The silence that followed was so profound that Grace could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Alexander stared at her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the floor. She had crossed a line. She would be fired. After 3 years of steady employment, after finally feeling like she had some stability in her life, she had thrown it all away in a moment of emotional weakness. "St. Catherine's," Alexander repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "You lived at St. Catherine's?" "Yes, sir. From age 7 to 13. And Michael Chen was your friend." "He was my best friend. The only real family I ever had." Grace's voice broke on the last word. She was going to be fired, so what did it matter anymore? "He was adopted when he was 8 and I was 12. I never knew what happened to him after that. I've been looking for him for 26 years. Alexander walked slowly to the window, his back to Grace, his shoulders tense. The morning sunlight illuminated the study in golden rays that made the dust particles dance in the air. Grace waited for the inevitable dismissal, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from shaking. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice held an emotion Grace had never heard from him before. Vulnerability. "That photograph was taken on the day I was adopted. September 15th, 1998. I was 8 years old." Grace's world tilted on its axis. The words made no sense. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Alexander turned to face her, and Grace saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. The same mixture of mischief and sadness she remembered from Michael's face all those years ago. "My birth name was Michael Chen," Alexander said quietly. "The family who adopted me changed my name to Alexander Hartford. They wanted me to forget everything about my life before them. They wanted me to become someone new. Someone who had never been unwanted, never been hungry, never been that scared little boy in the orphanage." Grace felt the room spinning. Her legs couldn't hold her anymore. She sank into the nearest chair without asking permission, without caring about propriety or rules or anything except the impossible truth unfolding before her. "You're Michael?" she whispered. "I was Michael," Alexander corrected gently. "For 8 years I was Michael Chen, orphan, nobody, and then I became Alexander Hartford, heir. Somebody." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But I never forgot. I never forgot St. Catherine's. I never forgot Sister Margaret, or the oak tree, or the brick walls. And I never forgot the girl with the dark hair and the sad eyes who shared everything with me even though she had nothing to share. Tears were streaming down Grace's face now, years of grief and loss and longing pouring out in silent rivers. "You promised you'd find me," she choked out. "You promised we'd be family again." "I know," Alexander said, and his own voice was thick with emotion. "I tried, Gracie. God, I tried. But the Hartfords sealed all my adoption records. They wouldn't tell me anything about my past. They said it was for my own good, that I needed to focus on my future, not my past. By the time I was old enough to search on my own, the trail was cold. St. Catherine's had closed. The records were scattered. I searched for Grace Chen, but I never found her. I was placed with a foster family when I was 13, Grace explained through her tears. They changed my last name to Thompson. Grace Chen became Grace Thompson. I looked for Michael Chen, but I never found you either." The two of them stood there in Alexander Hartford's study, separated by 3 feet of expensive carpet and 26 years of lost time, staring at each other as if seeing ghosts. "You've been working in my house for 3 years, Alexander said, wonder and disbelief mixing in his voice. 3 years. I've walked past you hundreds of times. He stopped, his face suddenly contorting with anguish. "I've treated you like you were invisible, like you were just the help, like you were nobody." "You didn't know," Grace said quickly. "That's not an excuse." Alexander's voice turned harsh with self-recrimination. "I became exactly what they wanted me to be. The Hartfords raised me to believe that people were divided into 2 categories, people like us and people who serve people like us. They taught me to be polite but distant, generous but superior, to never see the humanity in the people who cleaned my house or cooked my food or made my life comfortable." He walked to the desk, gripping its edge with white knuckles. "Do you know what the greatest tragedy of my adoption was, Gracie? It wasn't losing my name. It wasn't leaving St. Catherine's. It was learning to be the kind of person who could look right at you for 3 years and never truly see you. The kind of person who keeps your picture on his shelf but treats the real you like furniture." Grace stood, her legs shaky but holding. "I'm not furniture, Michael." "No," Alexander agreed, turning to face her fully. "You're not. You're the girl who taught me how to read because I was too embarrassed to ask the teachers for help. You're the girl who held my hand during thunderstorms because I was terrified of lightning. You're the girl who made St. Catherine's feel less like a prison and more like a home." He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if afraid he didn't have the right to come closer. "You're my sister, Gracie. Not by blood, but by something stronger than blood. And I've been walking past you for 3 years without knowing it." Grace closed the distance between them, moving on instinct rather than thought. 26 years of separation, of wondering, of grieving, collapsed into nothing as she threw her arms around Michael, around Alexander, around the boy who had been her family when she had no family. He held her tightly, and Grace felt him shaking with sobs he was trying to suppress. They stood there in the morning sunlight, 2 people who had been lost finding each other again in the last place either of them would have expected. But even as Grace felt the relief and joy of reunion flooding through her, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a question that would haunt the days to come. If Alexander had spent 26 years trying to find her, why had he never thought to actually look at the woman who cleaned his study every week? Why had he kept Michael's photograph, but forgotten how to see the invisible people all around him? And more importantly, what else about his transformation from Michael Chen to Alexander Hartford had cost him pieces of his humanity that even he didn't realize he'd lost? The Hartford mansion felt different after the revelation into his study. Grace moved through the familiar hallways with the same quiet efficiency she'd perfected over 3 years, but everything had changed. The carpets she vacuumed, the windows she cleaned, the furniture she polished, all of it belonged to Michael. Her Michael. Except he wasn't her Michael anymore. He was Alexander Hartford, and the distance between those 2 identities felt vast and impossible to bridge. 3 days had passed since that Tuesday morning. 3 days of awkward encounters in hallways where they both stopped, started to speak, then continued walking in opposite directions. 3 days of Grace catching Alexander staring at her during meals, his expression unreadable. 3 days of feeling like a stranger in a house she'd worked in for years. It was Friday afternoon when everything came to a head. Grace was preparing tea service in the kitchen when Mrs. Patricia Hartford swept in with the commanding presence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. At 72, Patricia Hartford was elegant, sharp, and absolutely terrifying. She wore her silver hair in a perfect chignon, her pearls like armor, and her disapproval like a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. "Grace," Patricia's voice cut through the kitchen like ice. "I need to speak with you, in the drawing room, now." Grace's stomach dropped. She followed Patricia through the mansion to the formal drawing room, a space so elegant and expensive that Grace usually only entered it to clean. Patricia sat in a high-backed chair positioned to catch the afternoon light, creating the effect of a queen granting an audience. Grace remained standing. It would have been presumptuous to sit without being invited. "My son tells me you've made a remarkable claim," Patricia began, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "You say you knew Alexander in the orphanage, that you grew up together." "Yes, ma'am. We lived at St. Catherine's." "I know where you claim to have lived." Patricia's tone could have frozen water. "What I want to understand is what you hope to gain from this revelation." Grace blinked, confused. "Gain? Please don't play innocent with me, Miss Thompson. You've worked in this household for 3 years. You've observed the family, learned about the Hartford fortune, understood the value of proximity to wealth. And now, suddenly, you have a convenient childhood connection to my son." The accusation hit Grace like a physical blow. "Mrs. Hartford, I didn't know. I never looked at that photograph before. I didn't recognize Alexander as Michael until it became advantageous to do so." Patricia stood, moving to the window with practiced grace. "I've seen this pattern before, Miss Thompson. People who suddenly remember connections to wealthy families. People who claim childhood friendships or distant relations or convenient coincidences. They always want something." "I don't want anything," Grace said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I was just as shocked as Alexander when I realized who he was." Patricia turned, her eyes cold. "Alexander has always been too soft-hearted. Even after all our efforts to give him the proper perspective on his position in society, he still carries these sentimental attachments to his past." She practically spat the word sentimental, like it was something distasteful. "We gave him everything," Patricia continued. "We took a nobody from nowhere and made him into someone who matters. We gave him the Hartford name, the Hartford education, the Hartford future. And now you come along, dredging up memories of who he used to be, threatening to undo decades of carefully cultivated identity." Grace felt anger rising in her chest, replacing the fear. "He was never a nobody. Michael was kind and brave and—" "Michael doesn't exist anymore," Patricia interrupted sharply. "Michael Chen died the day we adopted him. Alexander Hartford is who he is now, and I will not stand by while some opportunistic housemaid tries to exploit a childhood connection for financial gain. That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing, Miss Thompson?" Patricia's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Why did you feel the need to announce this connection? Why create this disruption in my household?" Grace opened her mouth to respond, but Patricia wasn't finished. "I'm prepared to offer you a very generous settlement, $50,000. In exchange, you'll sign a non-disclosure agreement, leave this household immediately, and never contact Alexander again. You'll never speak publicly about this supposed childhood connection. You'll disappear from his life as completely as you claim to have disappeared 26 years ago." The room seemed to tilt. "You're trying to buy me off? I'm offering you a solution that benefits everyone. You get more money than you'd earn in 2 years of domestic service. Alexander can move forward without these distracting memories. And I can ensure that my family remains protected from people who see us as opportunities, rather than people." Grace felt tears of rage and humiliation burning behind her eyes. "I don't want your money. Everyone wants money, Miss Thompson. That's what I've learned in 72 years. Everyone has a price. The only question is whether 50,000 is yours, or if I need to go higher." "There is no price," Grace said, her voice shaking. "Because Michael, Alexander, whatever his name is now, he's my family. He's the only family I've ever had, and I'm not going to abandon him again just because you're uncomfortable with who he used to be." Patricia's expression hardened into something terrifying. "Then you leave me no choice. You're fired, effective immediately. Pack your belongings and be off the property within the hour. I'll mail you a check for any wages owed." "You can't." "I absolutely can. This is my home, Miss Thompson. You're an employee at will.